My name is Peter Landau. I am the managing editor of newsjunkie.net, and today I have Isaac Saul with me. Would you mind introducing yourself, please?
My name is Isaac Saul. I'm a politics journalist, and I'm also the founder of Tangle News, which is a media outlet that emphasizes bringing in arguments from the right and the left on our big political debates of the day to give our audience a big, holistic, nonpartisan look at the news.
You started as a newsletter instead of a traditional publication. Can you tell me why that was your introduction to the market?
Always loved the newsletter platform. I think at the time, like it was a really intimate way to interact with readers. It was different than relying on social media traffic or podcasts or digital or print. It's really unique and special to show up in people's inbox and email back and forth with an audience. I also felt like it was a really good pathway for a business. In 2019, when I started Tangle, I didn't necessarily imagine it would turn into the big operation that it's turned in today. But I did know that building a personal audience where you wanted to have subscriptions and memberships, a newsletter was a really good way to do that. And Substack was just in its early days at the time. So there was a platform there that was really easy to get started on. I'm no longer on Substack, but at the time, it was very simple to just write my articles and press send and hit a mailing list with my stories, which felt really convenient.
Now, what did you take from your time at the HuffPost and A Plus into Tangle, and what didn't you take?
I'll start with what I didn't take first. I think at both Huffington Post and A Plus, I learned the perils of relying on social media traffic, SEO, and advertising revenue to run a business. I think those incentives make it really hard to have a news operation that's putting out not just quality work, but also work that avoids sensationalism or partisan hackery. When you're competing for clicks, search results, advertising revenue, and they're what your business is founded on, you have to find a way to grab people's attention. And it's often really hard to do that when you're trying to produce content that's more measured or balanced or even-handed. Both Huffington Post and A Plus, I think, were and are news outlets that offer a lot of value in the space. I don't mean to diminish the work that I did there or the positive elements of them as news outlets, but I also saw things that I felt like were broken and that were the result of sort of these corrupted incentives that I wanted to avoid. But yeah, more than anything, I think I just realized I didn't want to have a business that ran on ad revenue. And if you're relying on social media traffic for all your traffic, which we were at A plus, and in some ways we're at Huffington. Then if the social media platforms change, you're in big trouble. That being said, at Huffington Post, I learned how to operate in a really big newsroom. I learned how to cover breaking news. I learned really stringent editorial standards. I learned how to write fast. I had great reporters around me, people who had lots of experience in the industry. And at A plus, I had all of that. And we were also building a brand new media platform. So that was my first attempt at creating a new media startup. And I learned a lot of lessons from the ways we succeeded. And also, I learned a lot of lessons ultimately in how we failed and brought those to Tangle for sure.
A Tangle is, or it wants to be nonpartisan. So, what does that mean in practice, or is it just like a branding element for you?
Look, the straightforward definition of nonpartisan is not having a commitment to a particular ideology, or in this context, to a particular political group or alliance, which we don't. There are obviously news outlets who are very overtly shilling for the red or the blue side in our kind of tribal duopoly that we have here in America. At the same time, what we describe as viewpoint diversity. So when we say nonpartisan, what we mean is that we're going to air a really wide range of perspectives in our content, in our newsletters, in our YouTube videos, in our podcasts. If you read a Tangle newsletter from top to bottom, I believe you'll have a more holistic look at the news than you will reading any other news outlet in America right now. We're going out and finding people who are making arguments from the center right perspective to the far right perspective, and from the center left perspective to the far left perspective, and then a lot of heterodox thinkers in between too. And then, of course, we produce our own kind of original analysis from me or one of our staff writers every day. I think that just adds an extra kind of personal, interesting element for our readers to consume. That's kind of what we think about when we say nonpartisan. Of course, we're victim to the nomenclature of the time. There's definitely an element of it that's branding, but we do really try hard to make sure our audience is just getting exposed to a wide range of views.
Yeah, that brings up something in terms of, for me, like how do you define fairness when you're covering a political issue? Because there's certainly different perspectives, but then there's also like stuff that maybe shouldn't be given attention because it's just crazy.
Yeah, it's one of the really big challenging questions that we have. I would say generally my disposition is I'm not the arbiter of truth and I'm not the arbiter of what is in bounds or out of bounds. If we were only publishing views and perspectives that I thought were palatable, then the newsletter would not be about viewpoint diversity. It would just be about the viewpoints that I find acceptable, which is not the point of the newsletter. Candidly, sometimes we publish stuff that I find really offensive or gross or I think is crazy, but that's the point, right? It's not about me. It's about the arguments that are dominating the day. So there are times when I see arguments that are being popularized on the left or the right that for various reasons I might find silly or abhorrent or offensive, but we share them oftentimes in the newsletter because if enough people are embracing those arguments, then they're a part of the dialogue, and we feel like we need to share them with our audience so they really do have that wide range of perspectives. So it's a really hard thing and it's a big challenge, and we don't want to publish overt, mis or disinformation with our audience. We avoid publishing things that are verifiably untrue, things that we can disprove with a little bit of research. But we do share arguments with our audience sometimes that are edgy or might be offensive to some people.
I guess like how do you decide on the viewpoints from the left and the right? Just to dig a little deeper into that question, if somebody was talking about anti-Semitic tropes, would that be within the realm of what Tangle would cover as a legitimate perspective?
Yeah, it's really interesting. There are certainly people who I think have published commentary specifically about Israel or in the wake of the war in Gaza on October 7th that I personally feel like includes anti-Semitic dog whistles, but there are often arguments that are being published in mainstream progressive or conservative news outlets. And sometimes, yeah, we'll share things like that. And the sort of safety pin that we have that we can pull is we have this section every day in the newsletter that is our own unique analysis and writing. And so on the days where a piece like that is published, wouldn't let it go unanswered. I would address it in my own argument and analysis and why I felt like it was anti Semitic or why I felt like it was a dangerous line of thought. But yeah, the answer is if a writer is out there kind of profiting off of or proliferating a view that we as an editorial team might find really offensive or even anti-Semitic or whatever, we feel like that argument needs to be addressed somewhere in our content. We don't always make that decision, but I would say we err toward a sort of free speech maximalist view where we want to put those arguments in the arena and kind of deconstruct them, and we find more value in that than ignoring them.
From what I've seen of Tangle, are you giving equal weight to unequal arguments, or do you worry about both sidesism and like the editorial process to find that sweet spot for you?
I would say like the both sidesing is the criticism that we probably get the most from our audience, which is always interesting because it usually happens from both sides on the same day. But the general premise is when we are sharing, like a really common one might be climate change, right? There's a scientific consensus that climate change is happening and that humans are contributing to it. And some people feel like covering debates about how to address climate change is both sidesing an issue that's settled, What I found is often the debates are not really, anymore at least, about whether climate change is real or humans are contributing to it. It's about what the policy solution to it should be and whether the costs we're incurring by trying to address climate change are worth it. And when we really dig in and take those arguments on, I think we usually find that there are actually really reasonable, thoughtful debates happening in these areas. Like, are electric vehicle credits from the federal government a good use of the federal government's money or not? That's a really rich, robust debate. You don't have to necessarily believe or not believe that climate change is being caused by humans to have an informed opinion about that debate. And so we try and find the sort of engagement that's happening in these really like touchy hot button topics, and we often do it, I think, in a way that shows that there's viewpoint diversity even among the left and right political tribes that we have. Young Republicans in our country believe climate change is real and that we need to do something about it. You might not think that from watching the news, but all the polling reflects that. And we might share an opinion from a right wing writer who is worried about climate change, but doesn't think the Green New Deal is a good way to address it. And that's the way those debates often play out in practice when we're covering topics like that.
Well, when you're covering topics, like how much of the product is your voice, since you're such a integral part of Tangle, and how much is a institutional sort of editorial voice that you've developed?
I think for the first few years it was all me. I was the one writing the take every day. So once we got traction and I started bringing in subscribers, I realized that I didn't want a kind of cult of personality newsletter. I didn't want my voice or my take to be the truth or the final say. And so, as soon as I had the money to start hiring other editors and writers and allowing them to contribute to the newsletter, I started doing that. And what I think has happened is we have an editorial process that's so rigorous and includes so much viewpoint diversity among our editors that there is a particular tone and style that is, I think, measured and thoughtful and addresses strong arguments that are potential counters to the case, whatever the writer is making, that are just the product of working in the Tangle environment that you see in most of the newsletters. So I don't necessarily think we have a really distinct institutional voice in every piece of writing. My style of writing is really different from my managing editors, who I would say is like a little bit more academic and thoughtful, and I'm a little bit more brass and personality, I think, in my writing. And that sort of voice I don't think has been fine-tuned yet. But I think the style of argument, the thoughtfulness, the fact that like you won't really see super brazen, unhinged claims coming from us, like that sort of stuff is a product of the editorial environment that we have.
And in terms of your audience, have you done any research as to where they land politically?
For a long time, the numbers were about 40% of our audience was liberal, 30% was conservative, 30% self-ID'd as independent. So these are on surveys that we put out once or twice a year to our audience. So it's our most engaged readers who are taking the surveys. Also, we know from all manner of research, polling research, that liberals are much more likely to take surveys like that and share their political views and affiliations and what their salary is and their demographic and all that stuff than conservatives are. I suspect that the real numbers are probably even a little bit more balanced than that and a little bit more right leaning. In 2024, we had a big feature done on our work by This American Life, which is public radio, podcast station, NPR. And that brought in a ton of new readers, basically doubled our audience in the span of a month. And the public radio audience today in 2026 tends to be more liberal than conservative. So it skewed our audience a little bit more left. And one of our surveys last year, I think the numbers were more like 50, 20, 30, 50% liberal, 20% conservative, 30% independent. We've dealt with a shift there that we're trying to correct for because we want to be a big tent media organization and we want balance among our readership, just like our content. That's something that we're working on for sure.
And have you ever gotten pushback for an article from your audience?
All the time. Yeah. Every day we get pushback and we take a lot of feedback from our audience. What we found is among the people who are subscribed to our newsletter, the level of trust is really high and also equal, whether they are conservative or liberal, which is really cool. I think that's like probably the best use case test for us is we can have a Trump voter and a Kamala voter who are both subscribed to our newsletter. And if we ask them to rate their trust of Tangle on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest trust, they will both give a 4 or 5 rating. So, yeah, we survey our audience regularly. We get feedback and criticism from them regularly. And we find that really often offers really valuable data points to improve the product.
Are you worried about creating your own ideological bubble with your audience and your editorial?
Yeah, definitely. I think audience capture is a thing that a lot of news organizations face. There's a phenomenon that we see all throughout media, which is a news organization publishes a story that their audience really likes and wants more of. And then that news organization just publishes the same version of that story, recycled and slightly different over and over again on repeat. I worry about building an audience that's just extremely centrist or moderate. I think centrism is the political ideology in and of itself. If you have point A and point C, the correct answer isn't always point B. Sometimes one side's right and the other side's wrong. I don't want people to necessarily moderate their politics. That's not what I'm trying to do. It's a good outcome because I do think our politics are a little extreme, but more than anything, I want people to just be critical thinkers, have some skepticism, be respectful of people's views they disagree with, and have humility that they might not be right about everything, be open to changing their mind. Those are the kinds of values and outcomes and principles that I really care about.
I wonder, can neutrality even be possible in today's journalism? I read Tucker Carlson wanted to start a deeply researched website, probably with a conservative slant, but it went nowhere. And then, of course, we found where the audience was. You're the opposite of that. Is this something that's possible today?
Yes, I think it's something that's possible today. I never like the kind of objective or neutral language. Politics are personal. We're all products of our own personal experiences. I don't think there is any journalist who is objective or neutral. I actually don't think that's real. I think there are journalists who are fair and there are journalists who are hacks. There are journalists who are trying to do an honest job and there are journalists who are trying to inject their viewpoints in every story that they publish. I know who they are by reading all the commentary and content and everything that's out there, and it's not hard to spot once you start spotting it. But I know a lot of really liberal journalists who work at big mainstream news outlets who, when I read their reporting, I don't know what their politics are because they're really thoughtful and careful about how they publish a story. And the same is true of some conservative journalists that I know. It has nothing to do with whether they're neutral or they have subjective views or not. It's just that they're trying to do a fair and honest job in their work. I'm a person with opinions and experiences, and I'm sure I have a million different blind spots that I don't know about. That's why they're blind spots. But I also try really hard to be fair-minded in my work. And I think that's the really important thing. And there's a lot of journalists out there who aren't fair-minded or who have kind of activist tendencies or they want particular outcomes and their work reflects that. I think that's more the dangerous thing. And nobody can come into a story and just be truly objective or neutral. Yeah, I don't, we all have thoughts and feelings and they come out in different ways.
Well, new journalism proved that point that the reporter, by being in the story, is going to have a perspective on the story. But just to go back to Tangle, you focus on one story a day. Why that structure?
My view when I started was there were a lot of kind of short form, summary, quick hit type newsletters, Axios, Politico, Morning Brew, The Skim. There were all these places that were trying to pack 20 different stories into one newsletter. And I sensed that people really wanted to have a deeper and better understanding of the big debate that was the present moment. When I started Tangle in 2019, The Democratic primary was just kicking into gear for the 2020 election. There was a lot happening on the Democratic side. Are we going to take the Bernie, Elizabeth Warren progressive route, or will Joe Biden or somebody like Gavin Newsom prevail? There were all these interesting policy debates around Medicare and Medicaid and police reform, and then COVID happened and how we handled the pandemic. Donald Trump was in office and he was trying to build a wall. We were going to leave NATO and all this stuff. And I just wanted to meditate and ruminate and go long on one topic a day so people could have a really good understanding of whatever the debate was. I realized pretty quickly that 90% of the weekdays, there is a very obvious choice for what the topic is. There is usually one story a day or a week that's really dominating the news. And we are giving our audience a way to have a really good understanding of that. That was the thought process, was just like a longer, more in-depth, more nuanced newsletter, and something that our audience could spend 10 or 15 minutes with and leave feeling like they had a really good understanding of a topic.
I'm curious about what you think about the attention span in our fragmented media environment, especially since you're doing deeper dives into single stories in your Entangle.
It's a huge issue. The next generation is consuming news and information in 30-second sound bites, and sometimes even less than that. So we have to find a way to win that audience over and bring them into our tent. I think the problem is sometimes maybe overstated. Gen Z still reads, they still have books, there's still published authors coming out of that generation. A lot of them go to college and have to do essays and read books for school, and they have emails and inboxes. It's not impossible to reach them. I do a lot of college speaking, and I go to a lot of college campuses all over the country talking about Tangle and the media ecosystem. And I meet tons and tons of thoughtful students who are clearly really smart and have the attention span to sit through a 30, 45-minute lecture. I believe that they're reachable, but yeah, we're asking people to form a new habit by spending their afternoons with us. And that is challenging. It's a business challenge. We're not entertainment. This isn't TV news. We're not an Instagram influencer. It's a kind of sit down, grab a cup of coffee, have your lunch, whatever it is, and spend 10 or 15 minutes being curious and learning about a topic. And I think there's a big market for that, but it's certainly less addictive than maybe watching a 20-second video from some influencer. And we just accept that's the reality we're fighting.
I appreciate you taking the time. Have a good day.
Thanks, Peter. I appreciate the time and happy to do it anytime.